Welcome to Uncomfortable, conversations about culture and Christianity. My name is Eric, and today I am joined by Mark Ashton.
Bada boom.
Jess.
Hello, world.
And Alex.
Happy to be here.
Okay. I thought maybe you'd meet his bada boom with
Me
something
too.
or try to challenge
A
it.
bada bang.
Mark, thanks for being with us today.
Thanks for having me.
It's always fun to have you as a passenger for the whole thing.
Yes, it's always
through
fun.
the banter, through the headlines.
I'm on the uncomfortable train with you.
Yeah,
Yes.
great. That's good. Choo choo. Here we go. I thought we'd get things started with, a question. We like to start with a fun little, icebreaker here. What's everyone's tip for figuring out what is for dinner when you cannot decide? So maybe it's with your spouse, with your significant other, with a friend, with your whole family. How do you decide? No one, I don't care is probably a response you get a lot of times. What do you want for dinner? I don't care. Until you say the thing and then that doesn't sound good.
You can play that game for a long time.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
you have a silver bullet for us, Alex?
I don't have a silver bullet, but for me, I feel like when this happens, my issue and my spouse and significant other are the same, just to clarify.
I said or.
Or I know, but I'm just saying mine are both.
Okay.
One and the same. The issue is, she is like an I don't care person. So
Yeah.
if it's like, what do you want for dinner? And she's like, I don't care. I'm like, all right, we'll get Chinese. And then she's like, well, except Chinese. I don't know if you guys have been there. And then like, okay, I won't. All right, then we'll go to Chipotle. Well, except Chipotle or Chinese. I'm like, what? You obviously have something in your mind
while you're talking, because that
you
is
have something.
people's
So
lives.
that's where this question reminds me of. And so then we just pick, three things, and I say pick a number between 1 and 3, and
There you go.
solves it.
Then it could
Yeah.
still be like,
Yeah, even then. So I don't have a solution. I'm hoping to learn from you all.
Okay. Jess?
I
you
feel
have
like it's really perseverance. You just you can't give up. But aside from going out, one thing that I've done, there's apps that you can download, or I think there's a website that I'll use. But if I can't figure out what I'm going to make for dinner, you can put the ingredients in your fridge.
What?
Into this app, and then it says, oh, here, I tried it last night just to make sure it was still like a thing.
Yeah.
And I put in 10 ingredients that were in my refrigerator, and it came up with 76 recipes.
Jeez.
Yeah. So you
That's
can just
crazy.
Google it.
Can you say the app on the podcast, or is
I
that
can't
illegal?
remember what it is off the top of my head. There's all recipes I've used before.
So now
It's called All
76 choices you have.
Right. But then it's like,
That's
at
overwhelming.
least I can use my ingredients that I have.
Yeah.
It's true.
So that's a little tip that I've used, but most of the time it's kind of up to me, because Ben is not an awesome cook. So and Ben would admit that. Sorry, Ben. But it's normally it's going out if there's something that we can't prepare in the fridge for him. So
Yeah. All right.
Going out just like your microphone.
Yeah. I don't know why.
Sorry.
Someday we're going to get that fixed. Mark.
I would say with Kelly, it's pretty easy. The question is always, what do we have a gift card for? So
That's
if
a
we've
good
got a
one,
gift
too.
card, that just determines where we're going, because I'm cheap.
Yeah.
And one of the pastor bonuses I would say is we get gift cards regularly for restaurants. And so it doesn't really matter if it's highbrow or lowbrow. We usually have a gift card in the wallet somewhere. So
All right. That's pretty good. My wife will say, I don't care. And I've finally learned after over 20 years that she actually means that. And I think for a long time, I just couldn't get myself to believe that she meant it. And she doesn't, but now I have kids 10 and 12 who will say the opposite just to get under each other's skin.
well, that's fun.
And so then so what I'll end up doing is, if we were planning on going out somewhere, I'll say, where do you guys want to go? And if they start arguing, I was like, you know what? I'm just going to go find something to make in the kitchen. And then they're like, oh, no, we'll agree. So there's a little
anything
threatening.
but dad.
Yeah. Which I do. I do a lot of cooking. So I don't know. I don't mind the cooking, but it's just, I don't know. You got to make a hollow threat sometimes just to get things in
Just
order.
to get things done. I was going to say the app that I used is called Supercook.
Super cook.
Yep.
Okay.
Well, I did learn that, those listeners who really care about us, if they want to help any marriage conflict potential in my marriage, buy me gift cards.
Gift cards, there it goes.
Buy us gift cards, and then the problem will be solved.
Totally.
We'll go out with gift cards every day.
You're just gonna end up with a bunch of McDonald's.
If that's what it is, my kids would be really excited.
Also, there's that Facebook group. What is it? It's the Omaha Food Lovers group.
Okay.
And there are lots of really interesting things that people use in there. Like there's one couple that I follow that goes through the alphabet. So like the first, like they're on letter E now, so they have to eat at a E place.
Like a restaurant
Yeah,
name? That
starts with E.
That could get challenging.
Yeah, there's lots of different things.
X. Where are we going? Can it
Oh,
just
I know.
be in the name, like Texas Roadhouse? I don't
Could
know.
be.
I don't know.
Yeah.
Okay.
You make up your own rules.
All right. Well, there you have it.
Good luck, everyone.
Hopefully, we solved everyone's
Godspeed.
problems. Hopefully, they can figure out what to eat. Some real first world problems here we're discussing. Up next, we got headlines. Our first headline comes from relevantmagazine.com. It says Saddleback Church has ordained 3 women as pastors in defiance of Southern Baptist rules. So if you're not familiar with Saddleback, that's Pastor Rick Warren's church, where they recently, as the headline read, ordained 3 women. There were some rejoicing and some outcry all at the same time. So what's everybody's feelings around this? I mean, I think some of this definitely hits home for us in some ways, some of these things.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know how I like the phrasing of Saddleback Church has ordained 3 women pastors in defiance of the Southern Baptist. Like, I don't know if they were like, we're just doing this to stick it to them. It's hard to know. Obviously, them doing it is in defiance to those.
It almost seems like they made it a little clickbaity.
Yeah. I mean, which is what they do, what you do on the
gotta
internet.
read that.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, Saddleback, I know from a long history has had women pastors, and so whether they've ordained them or not, we've even had a gal that grew up here at Christ Community Church named Rachel Parmenter, who went out there and did an internship and learned a lot, grew a lot out there, and worked for Katie Edwards, who I've met in some youth ministry circles, who's qualified, awesome. And so I know it's not like a whole new trajectory for them. Like they were just like, oh, now all of a sudden we think women can, be ministers or hold the title pastor, because I know historically they've had that going on for a while. So, but it's a big deal because Saddleback is probably one of the largest, well-known SBC churches. I honestly didn't know they were SBC till this article. So.
Yeah, for sure, in the whole world. And I say, kudos to Rick Warren for taking a step in this direction. Man, he's been a world-shaping pastor and lived a life of integrity for lots of years. He's one of these guys I have immense respect for. And this is just one more thing that I feel like he is making progress for the kingdom of God. It's interesting because the idea of ordination is not really a biblical question, or women's ordination. It's an ecclesiology question. So it's, what is the church that you're part of? Who has the authority to be able to make those decisions? And one of the things that's interesting is that different denominations have different people who are the decision makers related to that. So sometimes I say it's like federal authority, state authority, or local authority. And in some denominations, like it's a rule from the top down. But the Southern Baptists in particular are very much local authority.
Okay.
Every church is independent. Every pastor is the king of his church. They don't have a bishop or a superintendent that they report to. There's no system above them. There's only a system below them. So in the Southern Baptists, you can pretty much decide anything you want church by church, and there's no authority or no leverage to slap your hand. The Alliance would be more like a state type of a system, and there's others like Episcopals, for example, that are more like a federalist type of system where they decide everything at the national level, and it all trickles down to the churches.
So I feel like they're using the word defiance, but it's more like making a statement from what you're saying. If it's a local thing, he's saying I'm endorsing this, supporting this, versus being defiant across the board.
Totally.
Okay.
Well, last
good.
year we saw Beth Moore announce that she was leaving SBC because of the limitations for women. And I guess my gut response was, oh, is this somewhat of a reaction to that? Like, is this a way for us to kind of show, hey, no, I know Beth left for this, but we are for women. This, obviously you don't want to degrade or devalue what they're doing for these women, but it does in some ways feel like a pretty big response to that concern that might have been raised.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So I know for us, and I think it'd be interesting to hear from you even on this, Mark, we are part of a denomination that is having these discussions and having conversations around women in ministry, consecration, ordination. There's a lot of different words that are thrown around there. And so we've, wrestled with, hey, do we overstep, the constituted authority that we have said we're going to go with for now, or do we try to make small changes and do what we can with their permission, and then on a national level continue to bring this about? So could you just fill us in a little bit on where we've made some of those decisions? Because I think some people have thought wrong or assumed wrong things about what we've done, and I think it'd just be a good way to hear from you on like our position and where we're at on this.
Yeah. I think, Alex, but I don't know if all of our listeners know that I'm very big on constituted authority and living within the boundaries of what the denomination, the districts say we should do. And so if it's a policy, my job is to submit to that policy. Even though my personal views on women in leadership, women in ministry are more expansive than what's allowed in our denomination, I'll expand it as far as the denomination will allow it, but not further than that. And then if there's changes to be made on a denominational level or a district level, I'll be a part of making those changes through legitimate channels. And I think, for the last 15 years, I've been working at taking Christ's community to the place where we say, hey, we are going to fully express everything that the Alliance allows women to be able to express on the local level. And then because I get to sit on the national board and have, friendships with some national level people, trying to help create and stimulate some changes that would expand what the Alliance allows for women as well. And so I've been in both sides of the equation. Really quickly, the backdrop on what the Alliance does related to ordination is they have the exact same requirements for men and women, but you get to the end and you get different results or titles. So men are ordained ministers of the gospel, women are consecrated ministers of the gospel. Men get the title reverend and pastor, women get nothing. And to me, I go, well, that doesn't seem right. And this is why we changed from calling our men reverends and pastors to calling them ministers. Because if men and women have the same requirements, both are ministers, ordained ministers, consecrated ministers, we want to do what we can to respect the scriptures, respect the authorities, and respect the hard work of the men and women that are going through the processes. And so we've made that kind of a change here. We've also had, since I came, we've created equal pay for men and women. There were some inequities that were here when I started. We've allowed women to be on the management team, stewardship team, and the governing board. And so we've expanded those roles. We've had opportunities for women to teach on stage and baptize and do communion and sing and do devotions and pray and everything that's within, the allowable paradigm of the church these days. We keep on pushing those borders in order to give opportunity for women who have gifts, because I really believe that leadership and speaking should be determined by gifts, not by gender. And so if you got the right gifts, you're allowed to be able to serve in that kind of a role.
Yeah, that's good. I think that's helpful for us. And I think that's helpful to know why. I mean, that constituted authority thing is big, because I think there's a lot of people that, want to just push past that and say, you need to just do it. If you really believe in it strong enough, which we know you do, then you need to do it. And you're a coward if you don't push past this, you know. But I do think doing it in the right way actually sets us up, in the long run better. There's some pain points in the middle of it, but I'm just grateful for how you've been leading us through that. So.
Absolutely.
Well, thanks. Yeah, and you probably know that there's some stuff coming up this summer with the national conversation that John Stumbo, our president, has been putting together related to women in leadership, that's moving the question essentially from the federal level to the local and state level. So right now there was kind of a weird vote that happened in 1998 that took away from women the ability to be pastors and be ordained. And so that's been the rule for 23 years, but it wasn't for the 100 years before that. And what John is saying is, hey, we've had different convictions. We've had different times in our history. Instead of saying there's a rule that everybody has to follow, let's let churches decide. Let's let districts decide this kind of stuff. And so that's what's up for dialogue right now is, will we allow different places with different convictions? Because in the Alliance, we've got people that are very conservative on women in leadership and those that are very progressive on women in leadership. And he's saying, well, there's plenty of room in the tent for everybody. Let's let local churches and elders decide on this issue. Keep the main thing, and give flexibility on things that are secondary.
Quick question with the secondary is, I've seen a lot of people say they make a secondary issue like this, that's not, salvation issue, a primary issue, because they say, if I can't trust how you interpret passages, Timothy, Titus, around women in ministry, then I can't trust your biblical, astuteness, that you even believe that the Bible is true and accurate and things like that. So how do we get over that? Because that's usually where it comes down to, is not necessarily, hey, my problem, because I've had conversation with people around this, isn't necessarily the interpretation of those passages that limit women or seem to limit women. But if they believe differently about that passage, then they must believe differently about other gospel things. How would you speak to that?
Yeah, it's a good question. And first of all, I would say I really respect people who take the Bible seriously and they say, I really want to do what the Bible has to say. So I love that. And usually the difference in the interpretation between people who are more conservative and more egalitarian is the egalitarians are really serious about context and nuance. And they say, who is it originally written to? And usually the two key classic cases, 1 Corinthians and 1 Timothy, it was an epistle, a letter written to a particular audience at a particular time. And they take a look at what was the context, the literary context and the historical context. And they just take that very seriously. So for me, that's a mark of really, really good Bible study. It's not a mark of compromise. It's a mark of really good Bible study because you're asking the question, what did it mean to the original audience before what does it mean to us today? Those who are more conservative tend to stick straight with the text, and they go, I'm just going to go straight from text to today and miss that middle part of interpretation. And what I would say is if we're going to become really good Bible students, we have to ask the question, what did it mean to the original audience? And when you do, those passages get really sloppy, and they need to be put in the context of the whole of Scripture. So did Paul allow women to teach? Did Jesus allow women to teach? Were they deacons? Were they apostles? And the answer is yes, 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 yes. Oh, okay, well, if all those things are the broader context, then perhaps the immediate context matters a lot. So my aspiration would be to say, hey, let's all become better students together. I've sat down, I think, with 40 people one summer when it was really controversial here at Christ Community. And at the end, most of them didn't agree with me when we got to the end. But most of them said, well, at least I can see that this is a very biblical and high integrity position. And so our goal isn't to agree with each other, but I think we need to have the grace to say, man, I respect your position. I respect your position. You're biblical. You're biblical. It's not a question of who's biblical and not biblical. It's a question of, what are the hermeneutical tools that we're using, and are those legit? And of course, historical context, literary context are.
That's good. That's helpful.
It's really good. All right, that does it for headlines. Up next, we're going to be talking about evangelism. Evangelism. I think we, as a church, we kind of have a good idea of what it is. Some people do. I hope so. But I think it takes a lot of different forms, and it's good to have a conversation about it and break it down. And we're glad to have Mark here for this to really make sure we're not missing the mark. When you use the word evangelism, what do you assume people are understanding that as? When you say evangelize, what do you hear in that, and what do you expect people to hear when you're talking about evangelism?
Yeah, so my expectation is when you say the word evangelism, everybody's uncomfortable. I think that's why it's perfect for the podcast, because people who are non-Christians don't want to have something imposed on them. People who are Christians are like, I don't want to have awkward confrontational conversations. And so the whole idea of it is a very uncomfortable subject, which is unfortunate because, you go back to the Greek word euangelion, where it comes from, and it means good news. So evangelism is actually, you're good newsing people, but for our culture, it doesn't feel like people are getting good news. It feels like they're getting hammered. And we've got to ask the question, how do we have these kinds of conversations in a way that affirms people, that Christians get excited about, that non-Christians feel comfortable with, and that we can love people through it all?
So when we know that there's baggage like that, with the word, and I think Christians maybe not embracing it the most full, and then we're tied to that word evangelical, do you feel like this is the best term to use, when we're talking about preaching the gospel, helping reach people with the gospel, helping them say yes to Jesus and presenting the good news to them? If we know there's that hurdle, do you still feel like, hey, this word is redeemable still, or should we start to think of other words, phrases that help us get the same point across, but are just a different wording that doesn't have so much baggage?
It's a great question. I think the word is redeemable, that we can use it, but you kind of have to define it when you're talking to the people of what you're talking about. Evangelical in particular, I think if you read the news, is a voting bloc. That's what most people think of when they think of the evangelical vote. And they don't think about historic Christianity and agreement with fundamentals and bringing the good news to people who need it. And so there's just massive baggage that goes with that. But I think sharing your faith, loving people, outreach, witnessing, these are all similar kinds of words that we could use that would get at the same general idea. But I think whatever helps people to get at the right idea is critical.
I think, go ahead.
I was just going to add that at Christ Community, we talk about reaching one more. That's the phrase that we love to use the most, is that we're on mission to reach one more, that every person matters to God, so they should matter to us.
I love that. I think that as we're talking, there's just like this uncomfortable feeling that even I empathize with in other people, where it's a very intimidating thing. Like even as a Christian, loving the Lord and it being one of the closest relationships, it's still one of the most intimidating things when you hear that word evangelize, because there's this, your insecurities can come into play of, do I know everything? Am I going to be able to articulate this right? There's this internal pressure, I think, that we put on ourselves. And is that something that you feel like has always been there? Has it developed over the years? Is it more now?
It's interesting because there's a book written by Rebecca Manley Pippert in it's probably 1975 or so. The very first line of the book is, Christians and non-Christians have one thing in common: both are scared of evangelism. And you go, okay, if she was saying that in 1975, there's nothing new under the sun. I mean, it was one of those things that it's been true for generations that people are uncomfortable about this. And I think one of the big reasons is that what you believe about God is at the deepest core of who you are as a human being. And when you start getting disequilibrium around that, it becomes really uncomfortable. And it's been that way all the way since the beginning. Jesus, of course, was a master at making people feel uncomfortable, but then being able to put together the pieces in such a way that they came back and asked for more. And we've got to figure out how we're going to do that too.
And I think a lot of times we think we have to have this rubric. And a lot of times how we evangelize is through our own personal experiences and through our stories. And that's how we experience and share Jesus with other people.
It's fascinating that Jesus never pulled out a 4-point outline.
Right.
He never said,
but we feel like we have to.
We do. And it can be a helpful tool, I think, for people who are learning, who are getting, off of square one. But over time, if you want to get like Jesus was, you figure, what are the windows that God's offering at this point? What are the questions that should be asked? How can I be a better listener? And that'll get you in a lot better than trying to, foist a formula on someone.
One of the... I remember getting the DC Talk album when I was a kid, and there's a quote that they have in the song Jesus Freak that is from Brendan Manning, and it says, "The greatest single cause of atheism in the world today is Christians who acknowledge Jesus with their lips, walk out the door, and deny him by their lifestyle. That is what an unbelieving world simply finds unbelievable. So when we get into like that kind of question, which I think is for a lot of people in conversations I have, especially in a social media era where sometimes we have really, really good intentions and we think the best way to preach the gospel is to type it out there for people to see, or to because we love people, we want to tell them why they're wrong and all the bad things about them. But what can we start to do for Christians that maybe have a low sense of EQ, emotional equity, or IQ when they're having conversations about this kind of stuff, just for their neighbors? Because I think the biggest thing that I fear sometimes is that I'm known mostly what I'm against than what I'm for. And I think that's really what this that quote comes down to, is how do we become better known for what we're for than what we're against, especially knowing how attached evangelicalism is in culture to, the words conservative or Republican or whatever. Though we didn't do that ourselves, we know we're living in a world that just does assume those things. So how do we begin to have good EQ and start to blow up some of that kind of stuff?
Yeah. And along with that, I would add, is oftentimes not just conservative Republican, but lacking compassion, not caring about the poor or the immigrants or
Homophobe,
the very things,
homophobe.
And some of them are the very things that Jesus said, hey, this is what I came for. And unfortunately, that's not what we're known for. I would say that if you're just talking about your neighbor, the most important thing to break down the barriers is what I would say is earn the right to be heard. So, you need to sit around the fire pit and have conversations about ordinary things with people. You need to find out, where are they at in the birth order? What makes them tick? What are they passionate about? What kind of car do they drive? What are they doing on the weekends? And all of those ordinary types of things creates a sense that I care about you as a person. And it can't just be creating the sense, it has to be real. Like, I really care about you as a person. And when we shortcut that by going straight after spiritual things without caring about the person, all of a sudden they'll go, oh yeah, I knew that that's what you were all about. Rather than, oh, here's my neighbor, and I think for those of us in ministry, like, we have a big barrier to overcome. It's twice as important for somebody who is a counselor, pastor, works at a church, to be people who genuinely care about people before we start telling them what we believe.
It's always that thing of going through the drive-thru at Starbucks or getting your hair cut, and you have these people who are just doing their job and trying to have casual conversation. They ask, where do you work? And I always kind of question, how do I answer that in a way that is not going to just turn this conversation off immediately? Because before I worked here, I worked at Grace University, which was kind of a similar thing. It's a Christian institution. So right away they judge what
just
you
an
are.
Assumption.
Yeah, like, I mean, if they're a Christian, then the conversation just kind of goes into that, oh, neat, that's fun, whatever. But a lot of times I feel like that can be such a barrier when I say, oh, I work at Christ Community Church. Oh, head down, let's just, please don't try to Mormon me. And it's just one of those things where there's just tropes that are out there that we live in and we live amongst, and trying to shed that is really difficult, because everybody, they know that they know what you're about. Whether they're right or wrong, they already have those assumptions.
Well, I think even social media even for me, I don't think my neighbors listen to this, but if they do, then maybe they'll know. But even for me, I follow my neighbors on social media. Even sometimes they'll add me, you have one conversation, you get to know their name, that stuff just starts to happen. And then you're like, oh, okay, I know. You can start pegging people based on, especially the last year in 2020, based on things like masks or things like who you're voting for and how much you're projecting out there. And then you're like, okay, I know some of the ways to talk to this person, but at the same time, I know this person is more far gone than I think So in that kind of world, how do we begin to not start to create biases in two ways? One, for people when we already kind of know that somebody maybe has an agenda, how do we start to break down that? But how do we not also project ourselves as people with agendas, I think is difficult. And I don't think just Mark is the one to answer this, but like, how do you do this? How do you balance that? Like what I'm projecting in a social world, social media world, when do I need to take a stand for things because it's just right and I need to take a stand? And then when do I need to, okay, maybe this isn't the platform or the place to do that.
I'm thinking of this, and I work at a church and I'm a counselor. So people think I'm trying to, come at them with the Bible and diagnose them with a mental illness at the same time. I mean, that's just a fact. So it's a lot for me. I've had to learn to be very direct, and if there's a comment made, like there's just a way that I can say it where I just address it of like, hey, I'm not thinking about you like this. I don't know if that's what you're saying, but that's not me. And that's where I think our lifestyle and how we're living and inviting people into relationships is so important. What you're saying, having those conversations around the fire with your neighbors or going out when they're outside at the same time and just being in relationship is one thing, but I think being direct and just being willing to kind of even like break the ice because you can see them going there and not being afraid to go in there with them into questioning that has been really helpful for me. But then I also just think with what you're saying, it's almost like preserving the relationship is really important. And let's not forget that I am asking the Holy Spirit for guidance minute by minute some days of what is the right thing to do, and God lead me to the next thing. And that's, I think, so important in this conversation as we're talking about relationships with people.
How about you, Eric?
Yeah.
Social media manager. How do you
Yeah.
how do you balance those?
I obviously bounce it very differently for the church's social media than my own. But I do think they're when you kind of, it feels like a leading question with the whole, where do you take a stand? Because I do think there's a lot of that on social media in general where people feel that what they post means more than it does. We put a lot of equity on what we say online because we see people of great clout being held accountable for what they say online. We see that all the time. People get canceled, people lose their jobs, whatever it may be. So there's a realm where certain people, what they say online means a lot. And so I think we've, as a society, kind of interpolated that into, well, everything I post on social media matters just as much as the president, because, and so we start to think that way around how we post and what we stand for. And I hear that where it's like, okay, when do I make a decision on when to just call out evil, and when do I make a decision to just post this thing that's, it speaks my mind? And I'm sure I've said this before, but I know I would go to work with my dad sometimes, and when he wasn't pastoring, he was installing carpet, and we would always have AM radio on. And I remember Dr. Laura Schlesinger every afternoon was on, and I probably felt like I went through like a crash course through some of the stuff that she would say on there. But the one thing that stuck with me was always, you need to put yourself in someone else's shoes. And I'd hear her say that all the time. And I just started to develop this, my empathy started to develop because of that, hearing it so many times. And that's just one thing. I mean, it sounds so simple, but it's so profound. Because no matter what it is, whether it's LGBTQ, whether it's abortion, whether any of the hot button issues, until you have experienced what other people have experienced, or at least maybe not experienced, but at least understood and heard from them and looked them in the eyes and heard their story. And Alex, you talk about proximity a lot. I think it is really what is necessary before you make these really just draw the line in the sand statements, because you're alienating so many people from even hearing the good that you have when you just come out, like the Kool-Aid man through the wall, just, I'm against this. This is bad. It doesn't accomplish what I think people think it's accomplishing.
When I was at my last job, I got to work with hundreds of people who were truly gifted in sharing their faith. And what you're talking about, Eric, of having that high empathy and the high emotional intelligence was one of the things that I found is that people who are good at sharing their faith have a compelling, strong, unusual ability to put themselves in the shoes of somebody else and then help them take their next step, wherever it might be. But if you can't put yourself in the shoes of that other person, there is no way you can be perceptive enough even to know what their next step is to help walk them down that lane. So I think for people who say, I want to grow, I want to get better at this, man, empathy is one of the most important things in being able to help people move forward spiritually.
How do you decide, Mark, what you post on social media? I mean, because you are somebody that does have more influence than any of us, even in this room, just because of the nature of your position and things like that. So how do you figure, hey, this is something that's going to help my witness and help the church? Because I think people can't untie what Mark posts on his personal page from the church. I think people just have a difficulty doing that. So how do you even process those things?
Well, I would say first off, I was hoping you would let me avoid that question and get away with the empathy thing because I would say imperfectly. I mean, one of the things I know is I'm still on a journey figuring out what's the best way for a lead minister to be able to use his voice in speaking into issues related to culture. So, one of the things I keep in mind, I think all of us should keep in mind, is that people on your social media page have different levels of relationship with you. So you've earned the right to be heard with some people, but other people, they're just new. They just know you from work or they live down the street or whatever. And so you have different levels of what people understand. And anything that you post on social media is necessarily reductionistic. It's always smaller than what the argument is. It's always too much of a soundbite. Even if it's really long, it's too much of a soundbite. So I work really hard to try and there are some times when I'll speak out about issues, but not about people. So you get to the political arena, I'll talk about policies, but I won't talk about candidates. I won't talk about parties that are out there. I'll talk about what, this policy or that policy, the effects that it has on people. And some people may connect the dots and say, I think I know what he's saying behind the scenes. But what I say publicly, I'm really careful about focusing on issues, if I'm going to talk about issues in culture or issues in politics. And then when I'm talking about Jesus, my goal is always just to be as winsome and good newsing as possible. So that people will always say, man, that's attractive. That's attractive. The Bible verses that I pick to post are usually not, harsh and condemning Bible verses. They're winsome. They help God to look attractive. They teach people the truths that this is why this is good news. And hopefully they tap into people's felt needs and say, I want to hear more. I want to learn more.
Good. That's helpful.
Yeah. Go ahead.
How much of it is, because I think you spoke briefly into this, there's people that I think this is a spiritual gift, or people that are gifted at evangelism, and you gave some of those, the people that you've worked with, and some of maybe the traits that they often have. So how much is it a gift that some people have? You've got people that have led crusades. You've got people like Billy Graham that have obviously gifted at this. How much is it a gift and we just leave it up to the gifted people versus how much is it a mandate? And then how do we figure out those of us who aren't gifted in evangelism yet it's a mandate, it's part of the Great Commission? How do we balance the two? I'm not super gifted at this, but I'm called to do it. And especially for you, how do you walk people through that as someone who is gifted at it? How do you work on empathy for, somebody that's not?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think, to start off with, I just affirm what you say. It is a mandate for everybody. All of us are called to be witnesses. Not all of us, if you think of a courtroom scene, are called to be lawyers. We're not called to be the one who's making the big case, making the argument, but all of us are called to talk about the things that we've seen and heard, the way that God's changed our lives, the way the impact has happened. And most of us, if you think about this, most of us have about 10 close relationships in our life. You might have 100, casual relationships and 1,000 acquaintances that are out there, but most people only have about 10 close relationships. So if you think about it, we need everybody in the game if we're going to be reaching a world that's lost and in need of God. So I think that's why it's a calling on every single person, is because each person, even dynamic, gifted evangelists, still only have about 10 close friends.
Yeah.
There's just a human limitation that's on that. So we need everybody in the game. I think the difference is a gifted evangelist has a higher percentage. So that's kind of the big deal difference. If you have the spiritual gift, you'll see people take more steps more quickly. Maybe over the line of faith, or maybe steps at other points in their process, but you'll just be the kind of person who happens to see people move along more quickly. But if we say we're only going to leave it to, say, the 10% of people who have the gift, then we got 90% of our potential that's still sitting on the sidelines. And even if they have a lower percentage, they still are making progress. And so for the sake of the whole kingdom, we've all got to be in the game making this progress. The other thing is that you never know if you're somebody who says, I don't have that spiritual gift, and you just reach, one person instead of reaching 10 people. Well, that one person you may reach may have the gift, and then they reach 10 people, and it becomes expansive. Or you reach somebody whose kids come to faith, and then those kids grow and they become gifted evangelists. There's just no telling what God might do in the generations past who you're reaching.
And I think a lot of what we're talking about is maybe who we're seeing in our relationships, like the lifestyle that we're living. But one thing that I remember about you, I mean, you've told stories periodically through the years that I've been here. I think the most recent one I remember, and maybe there's been one since then, is you were getting an oil change or something, and you just strike up a conversation with somebody, and you're talking about Jesus. And I think that those are the moments that a lot of us are a little intimidated by, is those intentional moments with a purpose. So how do you approach those moments?
Yeah. So that's pretty easy. When I have those glory stories that are out there, usually it's the top 1% or 0.1% story. For every one of those stories that comes, there have been 100 or 1,000 people that I just schmooze. And what I do is I approach every conversation with the idea that person in the drive-thru, that person in the oil change line, that person that I meet at Walmart, they matter to God. And I think one of the most important things we can do is when we find somebody who matters to God, we become fascinated with their lives. And we say, how can I make an emotional deposit into this person that's going to be positive? 99% of the time, it does not lead to a spiritual conversation. It doesn't lead to someone coming to church, but it's something that we do as lovers of people that Jesus called us to do. And then every once in a while, one of those will hit, and you get them on just the right day. Or, one of the disadvantages, Alex talked about disadvantage of being a pastor in these conversations. One of the advantages is sometimes in those random moments, you introduce yourself as a pastor and someone goes, I've been thinking about God. And you go, oh, well, then I guess we can be open to have a conversation here. And you move forward with those. And it's those 1% conversations that tend to get told over and over again. But I think that if you wake up every day with a sense that God's at work all around me, and maybe I'll run into somebody who I can at least be a blessing to, maybe get into a spiritual conversation with, you'll find that happens way more often just by being intentional in every conversation. This person matters to God, and I want to bless them and make their day.
Now, this is a very serious question, not really, but why do those 1% questions, those 1% conversations always happen on airplanes? I feel like I've been in the church for 30 years, and 90% of those stories are, I was on an airplane going somewhere. Yeah. I talked to the person next to me. Is it because people are afraid of death?
They're trapped.
When they're trapped.
Exactly.
But I've
they
tried
have to have a 2-hour conversation with you.
Yeah, I've tried, you have that conversation with a person, and I'm like, I just want one airplane story before I die in ministry, and I've got none. I'm 0 for 1,000. So.
Wow.
Just wait for the engine failure.
Yeah, that's when
you'll have a whole cabin full of ministry happening.
But won't be able to tell the story. Probably.
No, it'll be fine.
Depends on how they land it.
I think that leads into my next question, which is about extroverts and introverts and how evangelism looks different for them. Because I think the church has maybe a small problem with kind of putting the extrovert on a pedestal and saying, this is the way we do it. This is what it looks like. Everything's kind of built around an extrovert because, extroverts are a lot of times the ones on stage. And it comes naturally. And a lot of times for an extrovert, where an introvert is listening to all this and they're getting sweaty and nervous. And for myself, I consider myself probably more of an ambivert, because there are certain things where I am very extroverted, but then there are other things where I'm very introverted. But I just wonder how could even the church maybe do a better job of addressing that and disseminating information in a way that helps kind of bring the extroverts in on this? Because I do know, like, my extroverted side is probably where most of my evangelism lives. Mm-hmm. And it's one of those things where it's much more about the long game. It's about making a friend and then just kind of slowly, working to those conversations. But I mean, I've been with other people that were just, at the Burger King, and he goes up and just starts talking to the cashier, and they break down in tears, and like this whole thing. And I'm just standing.
That's Jess, the counselor side.
And I'm just standing there going, like, part of me feels like, yeah, I would like to do that, but like, am I a bad Christian now? Because I wouldn't probably do that. I don't, do I not get as many jewels on my crown in heaven? Like, what is that?
Yeah, I have some good words for folks who are introverts out there, because in my experiment at my last job, where I knew the hundreds of people who were gifted, most of them were introverts. That was one of the weird things. Now, I'm an extrovert off the scale, so my style is going to be different than what the introverts are. But most of the people who led the most people to faith were introverts. So I did a little bit of study with them, asking a lot of questions. And I think the reason is the people who are the best evangelists are not the best talkers. They're the best listeners. Mm-hmm. And so introverts tend to be better listeners than the extroverts are.
Yeah.
And here's what happens when you listen is you find out where people are coming from. I think that the most important tool for an evangelist is not having a presentation, it's having a question. And you ask the question, you find out where someone's at, you ask the next question deeper, you ask the next question deeper. Pretty soon you're finding out what people's core needs are, what kind of feelings are deep in their life, what the gaps are in their understanding about God. And then when you say something, it might be 10% of what the extrovert said, but what you said is incredibly relevant because you've listened well enough to find out where that person is coming from. So I would say introverts of the world unite, ask great questions, find out where people are coming from. It'll give you an amazing platform to speak into people's lives because you know where their starting place is.
Yeah, that's good.
One of the things I ask people, if you're trying to give someone directions, let's say someone calls you up and says, besides, let's assume Siri's not in the equation. But if somebody says, hey, can you give me directions to where you are? The first question you ask them is, well, where are you? Because, you got to know where they are in order to find out how to get here. As evangelists, one of the big mistakes we make is we oftentimes tell people where to go without finding out where they're at. And then our directions are irrelevant. So we've got to find out where are people coming from. And in order to do that, you've got to be a passionate listener.
Yeah. Wow. That's good.
That is good.
So thinking about all of this, it kind of comes down to we can say lots of things and have lots of conversations, and be a great listener, be a great talker. But then there's this other part of us that happens when we're not even interacting with people, and that's people watching how we're living and how we're treating other people and how we're talking to our kids. And that's what I would call our witness. And so can you talk a little bit about just how important that is, how it can help us, what are things we can do to harm that, and how important that is?
Well, yeah, I think you've set it up well in that it's a critical aspect of what we do in order to be able to share our faith. I know that in, I would say, my last neighborhood, I saw a number of people come to faith in Christ. And a lot of them later on would say it had more to do with what kind of a dad you were than what kind of arguments you made. So they see, the way that we're raising our kids, the way we're interacting with them, and if they came from a different kind of background, they go, oh, that's notable, that's remarkable, I wonder where that's coming from. It creates the intrigue. And I would say everything from how we treat our kids to the language that we use. Man, one of the biggest tip-offs to where you're at spiritually is what kind of a language are you using, and are you the same or different than the culture that you're swimming in? And that can be very attractive and compelling to people. And there's the obvious things about, am I, abusing my employees? Do I work hard? Am I cheating on my expense reports? All those kinds of things that are, I would say, more obvious. But if those things aren't in place, people will automatically go, you're a hypocrite. And I think as Christians, we have to be super aware that we are telling people, by identifying as a Christian, that I live at a higher standard. And so anything that we do to undermine that is going to subvert the way people think about us. Now, I don't think most Christians think they're saying that. They don't try to say that. They don't try to say I'm better than you, but simply as identifying as I'm a follower of Jesus, people know, oh, well, you're trying to be like Jesus, and therefore there's certain expectations I'll have of you. We want to meet those where they're legitimate.
So what are some tips you have for just taking the conversation from mundane to spiritual? So for example, the other day, and I try to pray for these interactions and, okay, what are the typical normal interactions that are happening in my life and how do I start to turn them spiritual? Some are successful, some aren't. Like the other day, I think even us hosting a vaccine clinic, one of my neighbors is a principal. And so, my kids are in school. And so I'm like, hey, what's the status on masks next year? What do you think? When are they going to make that decision? All those kind of things. And got to talk about vaccines. And then she's like, yeah, I got vaccinated at Christ Community Church. I'm like, boom, there it is. Thank you, God, for, that. But then after that, and I was like, oh yeah, that's where I work. That's awesome. How do you start to take that spiritual? How do you just not let that hang there of like, that's awesome. All right. Have a good day. But help me in that conversation. What would not Jesus do? What would WWMD? What would Mark do in that kind of conversation? Do you just let it hang there?
Yeah.
Do you wait for the next conversation to pick that? Because sometimes it's hard to pick that back up. Yep. Like, hey, remember how I told you I work at Christ Community Church?
Yeah.
And they're like, no, what are you talking about? Yeah. So help me, school me there.
Yeah, so I would say in spiritual conversations, there's usually 4 levels that you go through. So, and it's easy to remember, it's FIND, so you're helping someone to find God. FIND, it's facts, ideas, needs, and decisions. So FIND. We oftentimes, in our spiritual conversations, want to go straight to decision. I want to invite them to church. I want to give them a book to read. I want to help them to pray to receive Jesus. And we skip the rest of the funnel. And people in the normal world are like, that was a really weird conversation. Like he came out of nowhere and was asking me for stuff. The way that normal people have conversations is they start off talking about the weather, the masks, the vaccines, what's going to be happening in the news, all those kinds of things. And then you want to get to the next level lower, which is kind of a values question or an idea level question. You get from facts to ideas by asking a question. It's always the way you move into the next level. Sometimes, there's some people who are philosophically savvy that can, build a bridge by telling stuff. But the best way is to ask the next question about them. I work at Christ Community Church. Do you have any church background? And then you allow them to be able to say, here's how deep I'm willing to go on that. So it may be really a shallow thing. Yeah, I went a couple of times when I was a kid. It may be the kind of thing they go, yeah, I got really hurt by the church, so I left. And you can tell how deep they're willing to go by how much they kind of give themselves towards the conversation. Same thing is true when you're in the ideas category. The way you get from ideas to needs is by asking a question. And the reason I love questions at every level is it allows the other person to govern how far they're willing to go in the conversation. So you're showing I'm willing to move to the next level with you by asking the question, but I'm not going to force you to. I'm not going to strong arm you to. I'm not going to share something that's really weird. I'm just going to ask where you're at. Then at that needs level, once they get down to here's kind of some needs that I have. Let's say I've been hurt by the church, but I've really sensed that, God's been absent since then. You go, okay, that's a need that somebody has that I can speak into, and then help them to be able to find some answers to that, give direction, help them to make the decision of what's their next step to be able to sense God in their life a little bit more. So I would say navigating those conversations is it's like a funnel where you keep going a step deeper. With that said, just kind of the WWMD, I would say 80 to 90% of my conversations never get out of facts. Like, we don't go the next step deeper. I might ask the question and they rebuff it, or I might not even ask the question because it's a short conversation. It's the opportunity to go to the next level that you allow the person to govern, and eventually, sometimes you'll get to that decision point.
Quick question. When do you just know I'm not, I've got them to the 30-yard line, or, I've helped them get on base, but the rest, God's going to have to use someone else, like they've just shut down, they've put up a wall, and I have to live next to this person for the rest of my life, or the foreseeable future. Maybe it's a neighbor, a sibling, or whatever. And they've just, between you and trying to reach them with the gospel, they put up a wall, and when do you just say, okay, I'm trusting that God's going to use the seeds I've planted, but then pray for the next person instead of like continuing to just try to kick down a wall and seeing that it's just bruising and hurting you and hurting them, because I've seen that
Yes.
happen in lives. Even I was talking to someone yesterday and that was their sibling, and they're like, how do I navigate this?
Yeah. Yeah, I think for us, you've set up the question very well as to what not to do. I think for us, the key thing is we leave the door open, we keep on loving people, and then we're able to move at whatever pace they're ready for. So we stay as people who are prayerful and are loving regardless of what takes place. That's what we keep on doing forever and ever. But it may not be that our conversations make spiritual progress, sometimes for years, sometimes for decades with people, but we leave clues that let them know that we're open to talking about that and that we love them regardless of whether we talk about it or not. Because for those, particularly those inner circle conversations, my neighbor, my family member, I'm going to be seeing them 2 or 3 times a year at Thanksgiving and Christmas and all these kinds of things. We want to say we're playing the long game by praying for people and loving people, and then allow them and allow the Spirit to work in their lives. One of the things that happens, I think, is when people truly feel loved by somebody, when they have a crisis, they go to the people who they know love them. And so the truth is, in everybody's life, there's ups and downs, there's crises that'll come, and if they know that you love them, that's oftentimes the point of spiritual openness they have, and they'll come to you in those moments.
Good.
So, Hugh, go ahead.
I just know one of the phrases that like helped even change my mind around some of those things was that people aren't problems to be solved, they're wonders to behold. And even helping me understand my neighbor, anybody, they're wonders that are created by God to behold. And if I approach people as that, and that makes me want to get to know them, makes me want to explore the wonder and how they were created, rather than approaching everybody as I'm a Christian, they're going to hell, there's a problem, I need to solve it.
So good.
And so
It's not just approaching it as a conquest.
Yeah.
That's- So Huey Lewis in the News had it right when it's the power of love. That's what you're telling us.
Right on.
Uh-huh. Okay.
It's my first Huey Lewis in the News quote in an evangelism discussion, but it's good. It's good. Yeah.
Okay. Any closing thoughts for us around love? I mean, I think you kind of said your piece on some of that, or anything else in this topic that you feel we maybe missed that we should say?
Yeah, I think probably one of the most important foundational pieces that's worth talking about is that evangelism or witnessing or whatever we would call it is partnering with God. That God has gone first for us in this, and that it takes all of the pressure off of us if we say, you know what, I can trust God to be moving forward with this. I'm partnering with Him. I begin every day with a sense that God's already at work all around me, and I'm just joining God in whatever God happens to be doing. And as I see those moments, I'm joining in with God and doing what He's doing. As Alex mentioned, if it winds up that there's a closed door or you get so far and you have to stop, you can be under the impression, well, God's in charge. He's in control. He's going to take this ball with whoever He wants, whenever He wants. And I think that strong sense of God being at work and God being in charge gives us freedom. It just takes all the pressure off to have to perform. And just to say, okay, God, whatever you're doing, I'll join you. As far as you take it, I'll go, and I'll trust you for the result.
Good. All right. I think that does it. Thank you for taking some more time this week to
Awesome to be here.
Spend with us and clearing up some of these questions we have. I think evangelism in general, it's one of those things, like we mentioned at the top, it can seem intimidating. And it's not just to new Christians. It's something that's a lifelong challenge to keep engaging and not just kind of get lazy about it. But thanks everybody for being here, and also thanks for everyone who's listening or watching wherever you are. We appreciate that. If you have any questions or concerns, you can reach out to us on social media at CCC Omaha, or you can send us an email to podcast@cccomaha.org. We'd love to hear from you. Until then, we'll talk to you later.